Chinese and U.S. officials have been talking about the future of bilateral relations since Mr. Biden took office. How do we see the next 4 years spanning out? How can we expect from the new administration on two fronts, for example, bridging the divide and winning respect and trust from other parts of the world? Let's loop in our panelists. For more on China-U.S. relations, joining us in Beijing, Xie Tao, professor and dean of the School of International Relations and Diplomacy with Beijing Foreign Studies University. Also in Beijing, Professor Da Wei, and senior fellow of the Center for International Strategy and Security with Tsinghua University. In Wyoming, U.S., Robert Ross, associate from the John King Fairbanks Center for Chinese Studies with Harvard University. Gentlemen, welcome to the program. Tell me more about your immediate response to what Mr. Yang Jiechi, the state counselor in charge of foreign relations, had to say earlier about China-U.S. relations. Professor Da Wei.
China's top diplomats sent the positive signal to American audience. I think this fact itself is extremely important because I think actually the whole world, including our two countries, are expecting the two countries can improve their relationship. But here the problem is who take the lead, who should take the lead, because the two countries, both countries blame each other for the faults in past 4 years. So now, though we want to improve the or stabilize the bilateral relations, the question is who should take the lead. And I think Director Yang made this speech and sending a positive gesture, positive signal to the American audience.
Yeah.
I think that will be very helpful, for the bilateral relations.
Got it. Professor Xie, the olive branch has been extended by State Councilor Yang?
Yeah, Tian, look, we have a series of China's top diplomats, making very important speeches. We have the Chinese ambassador to the United States, Mr. Cui, and then we have a foreign minister, Mr. Wang Yi, and then this morning we had China's top diplomat, Mr. Yang Jiechi. My take on this is that China is trying to send a message that we are trying to set the tone for the new administration's China policy. Whereas in the past, it often happens that the US diplomats will try to set the tone for their incoming administration. Whereas this time, we all know because the Biden administration is so preoccupied with many of its own domestic issues, I don't think they are really in a mood or prepared to set the tone. So I think overall, the Chinese government is trying to be more proactive compared in the past to try to set the tone for the years to come.
Professor Ross, Mr. Ross, what do you make of the options that the Chinese State Councilor Yang put forward there in terms of where U.S. and China should be?
Well, he certainly made a very positive statement, which is, of course, welcome to the American audience. I should say that there were many positive statements from the Chinese over the last 2 or 3 years, 4 years, and in many respects, the Chinese have been very patient with Donald Trump and many of his policies. The problem we have going forward is that as Xie Tao said, the Biden administration is preoccupied with many other issues. So it will be difficult for the Biden administration to send positive signals right away back to China.
Mr. Ross, what's your observation briefly about whether there is a pause or not since the new administration comes in?
Well, the bureaucracy will respond to the new leadership. And Secretary of State Pompeo is gone. Our national security advisor is gone. Our president is gone. And so they have the opportunity to create new policies. We haven't seen them yet. We have to be patient. I must say that thus far, we haven't seen reciprocal language from the Biden administration. We've seen tough language from the Biden administration. And it's too early to tell whether that's signaling tough policies. And this is what any new administration might do in order to set the tone against the Republicans, against the opposition, to avoid charges of being weak. And then later, when they have the opportunity, having established their credentials as being tough on China, they can adopt more moderate policies. We have to wait and see.
Professor Da Wei, how much patience does China still have if things are going still downward because of the earlier trend and no reset, what's going to be China's reaction?
I think China, we have patience, but the problem I think probably is not about patience, but how long a window of opportunity can we have?
Well said.
As we discussed, the Biden administration is preoccupied by domestic affairs, and China will have the party's Congress, and the US will have a midterm election. So let's say if Biden administration uses first 6 months or even longer time, basically focus on domestic thing, and there's no change in China-US relations, then the window of opportunity won't last very long,
right.
Probably only several months or 1 year. Then we will have major domestic political agenda. So if we cannot achieve something in next 2 years, probably it will be even harder for the second 2 years of the Biden administration.
But Professor Tian, let me come to you. You've been researching about the U.S. culture, particularly political culture, over the past years. We know that it is not about just Trump, one person, or some of those close contact with him, but rather so-called the Trumpism, whether you believe it is a ism or not. So earlier you heard both of the other two panelists talking about how much of window opportunity do we have. Well, how much?
Well, I think I agree with both of my colleagues here. We do see a window of opportunity, but like we all agree that the Biden administration is so preoccupied with many of its domestic priorities, and so my sense is that they probably will not come out with a coherent, very clear strategy towards China until about half a year from now. So could the U.S. allies wait? Could Beijing wait? I think that we don't have no choice. We have to be patient, and the Chinese government has been very patient. Now, I also have to say that this is a consensus among not just the Chinese analysts, but also among most U.S. analysts, that it would be completely impossible to expect a reset or a complete reversal of the Trump administration's policy towards China.
Mr. Ross, in the speech by Chinese State Councilor Yang, the very first proposal when he talked about a better U.S.-China relations from China's perspective is about to throw away the Cold War mentality. That's a Chinese catchphrase to describe that there is only one winner in the relationship between China and the United States, as some in the U.S. believe. So, Mr. Ross, do you think that is likely to be achieved if other areas of relationship are warming up in terms of China-U.S.?
Well, a few things here. One, I agree with my colleagues, but I would caution that it might be better that we do not announce a new China policy. It might be better that we not try and reach a new agreement. Rather, the Trump administration was sending all these high-level visitors. If we stop sending visitors, that's a powerful signal. The Trump administration approved all these arms sales. We have no new arms sales, and the ones that were agreed upon are very slow to arrive. That would be a positive signal.
Mr. Ross, there's also concern, at least among some in this part of the world, whether the new administration, under huge pressure with its domestic agenda, would use the issue of China-U.S. relations as an exchange for some favorable agreement with either the Capitol Hill or some of the other important figures for its domestic agenda. Are you worried about that?
No, our system doesn't work that way. Primarily because our Congress, our members of Congress, really don't care about foreign affairs unless it contributes to votes at home. They care about budget items, they care about taxes, they care about programs. And so there are trade-offs in Congress. If you give money to my district for this, I can support you with funding in your district for that. They look at foreign policy as just a free ride, and they can criticize the administration whenever they want. and they're not going to stop criticizing it because of a domestic political agenda. Members of Congress are notoriously irresponsible because if they put pressure on the White House to do things, and then things go wrong, both the White House's fault, not Congress's fault.
Okay.
So this is one of the dilemmas we have in our congressional system.
Professor Xie.
I'm actually concerned that the Democratic Party would follow in the steps of the Republican administration and become a party of no in China policy. In other words, anything that China proposes, the Democrats or Republicans will say no. Anytime when China says no, the Trump administration or Biden administration would say yes. So that kind of domestic politics polarization would spill over into foreign policy. And so that could embolden the Biden administration or some of these, the executive branch of officials to make sometimes outrageous comments about the Chinese government or the Chinese people.
Professor Dan, your thoughts?
President Biden is bringing back professional diplomats and analysts back into the government. And we can have a more professional and predictable relationship, maybe not cooperative, friendly relationship, but at least stable and predictable.
We've been hearing about your thoughts in so many aspects. All of them, as you suggested, are linked to the public opinions in both countries. What about this public opinion? How important are they now in both countries? Who are shaping it? How they are being shaped earlier in the past 4 years? And will this rhetoric war, in a way, go away and be replaced somewhat by predictable and stable conversations? That's wondering right now. Professor Dai, you want to go first on that?
First of all, I think it's shaped by the events, by the policies, by the news. Secondly, I think it's also shaped by the government, by the opinion leaders of the two sides, two countries. So the good news is probably we won't have so many surprise or bad news. So that's a good news. So then I think the duty is on our media, on our public opinion, and on the two governments, not to blame each other, not scapegoating.
Well, Mr. Ross?
We now have professional diplomats in charge. And so we're going to restaff our embassy. Our embassies have been understaffed under Trump. We don't have experts in trade. We don't have experts in drug trafficking. We don't have experts on the environment. We don't have experts on health. So now we're going to communicate better.
So it seems
that if there's a public opinion issue, our diplomats can say to Chinese diplomats, this is what's happening. This is why we're doing this, but this should not interfere with other things. And that should make it far easier to deal with the no's while we try and reach agreement on other things. And in particular, as Dawei was saying, the trade issue. Trade issue has been a disaster for America. Joe Biden wants to end the trade war. He will work hard to get to yes, but it must be negotiated.
Professor Xie.
Now we have a new administration, and but the conspiracy theories will continue to spur around in the United States. So I would not be so optimistic that U.S. views towards China will suddenly become much better. So I wouldn't be surprised if we see that there is just a slight improvement of Americans' view of China. And it will take at least a couple of years for American public opinion to kind of recover back to where it was before 2028 or maybe 2018.
My only response to that quickly is that everything you say is absolutely correct. But if you look at Gallup polls during the campaign about what was important, China was like 16th on the list of what was important to U.S. voters. So there's a lot of room for the president to do what he wants on China and not worry about re-election.
Right. I totally agree with Mr. Ross. That is American elites, the president, secretary of state, and all these elites have a very important role to play. That is to educate American public about the current state of US-China relationship. If they abdicate that important role, that spells big trouble for our bilateral relationship.
Have we been dancing around the eternal issue, which is what is going to be the nature of this relationship, given what happened already over the past 4 years, given that China economy is growing, and given that we are in a crisis, different countries have different performances, given what we don't know about the US politics in 4 years, maybe 2 years already, given that the world is really changing, maybe US doesn't want to reset the agenda, or China may not want to, but the world is changing despite whether you want to or not.
I think there is one word we didn't mention today, that is competition. There is competitive elements in the bilateral relations, that's for sure, and it will continue to be there. But we want to limit or give it a boundary. The competition need to have a boundary, and we also have cooperative elements in the bilateral relations. And our goal of competition is not to make the other side collapse. We need to compete to show who is better and whose system is better. I think that will be good, and that will be good for the people.
Well, it's hard to improve on Professor Dao's analysis of the relationship. The choice we have, and this is the choice in the United States, is do we want to move the relationship to comprehensive competition in every field, or do we want to go where Professor Dao was saying we want to try and put limits around the competition and cooperate where we can? Now, I think it's clear the Trump administration wanted to move the relationship to a Cold War relationship. When they said decoupling, when they said all of government approach, that was an effort to create an iron curtain, if you will, in the United States and China. But that was not a policy driven by the competition. But the US-China relationship is so different that we have a much wider range of choice on where we want to cooperate and the ability to cooperate. So that's where I think we can try and move this relationship toward, is to restore that cooperation in all those areas where there is possibility for mutual gain.
Yeah. Professor Xie, last but not least.
Unfortunately, right now, China or United States is somehow mutually perceived as an existential threat to the other country. And under these circumstances, it's very hard to have a normal competition. So I think that's where the difficulty is. How can the leaders, especially in the capitals of the two countries, to frame this competition not as existential threat, but as a healthy, as a constructive, as a stable competition that in the long term could bring enormous benefits to the peoples of the two countries?
Oh, well said. I want to thank you so much at this critical time, helping us to understand things much better and also share your instincts about this bilateral relations and certainly your constructive views about where it is going. Thank you. And you're watching World Insight. Coming up, a shift in U.S. foreign policy. How's the Biden administration's engagement with the world shaping up? Any meaningful change? Direct answers from the chief economics commentator of the Financial Times. This is World Insight. I'm Tian. 2 weeks into Joe Biden's presidency, many are pinning hopes on his administration reversing U.S. policy that often blindsided them. But could the Biden administration deliver meaningful changes? How soon can U.S. allies see a policy shift? On that, I talked to Martin Wolf, the associate editor and chief economics commentator of the Financial Times. In an exclusive interview, he says a stable U.S. relationship and leadership is imperative for forging common ground with China on many areas that require cooperation. Take a listen. I'm joined by Martin Wolf, associate editor and chief economics commentator from the Financial Times. What a pleasure, Martin.
Great pleasure to be with you.
Let me start by asking you, with a recent article illustrating where the U.S. is, where do you think, if you could briefly help us to understand, it is?
Well, it's obviously a very complicated story. The country, it is quite clear, is very deeply divided politically. And that was shown by the really quite extraordinary and unprecedented events in the last few months since the election, culminating with the invasion of the Capitol on the 6th of January. These divisions have not disappeared, but we do have a new administration, a very different sensibility, very centrist, with a very familiar sort of technocratic team. But they have a very weak majority in Congress, particularly in the Senate. It's not clear what they will be able to do. So I think we have a politically divided America, which will find it difficult to do the sorts of things required to reunify the country, to make people believe fully in America again. And that's the biggest problem. Economically, in fact, despite the terrible ravages of coronavirus with 400,000 dead, the United States didn't do too badly, and obviously not as well as China, but not too badly. And most people expect a pretty strong recovery this year with a big boost from government support, government stimulus. But still, lots of very large problems in the United States and a huge loss of credibility in the world under Trump.
We are going to go through some of the points that you just mentioned in detail. For example, about the U.S. economy, a lot of people are worrying about the debts. And of course, Janet Yellen will be the Treasury Secretary. She's a well-respected person, yet the U.S. needs a lot of money right now. Where does the money from? If they keep on printing money, what does it mean for the other economies? These are big questions.
Indeed, they are. I think the debt per se is quite manageable at anything like current interest rates. And we've had very low interest rates now for a long time. Of course, that doesn't mean it won't change. It may, but we have no strong reason to expect interest rates to change. There's not going to be a huge growth in demand in the world. And debt service, which matters much more than the debt stock, is relatively manageable. So I don't regard the debt as a huge issue. They can finance the deficits by borrowing. And of course, as you said, they can print money. Now, the US dollar is the world's leading currency still, and people want to hold it. The dollar may weaken a little, which will be a bit problematic for others, but the Americans won't mind. There's the famous line of a former US Treasury Secretary now half a century ago that it's our currency and your problem. So I think it's likely they will continue to pursue loose monetary policy too. The only real constraint, I think, is not the debt or the money, it's inflation. Would there be an inflationary upsurge following this huge monetary expansion? I think it's unlikely, but it's not inconceivable. Yeah. If that happened, we would be in trouble.
Martin, if we look at what is going on there in the United States, the question is about time. How much time would the Biden administration need to put things into order that the allies of the United States would say, well, the U.S. is back, rather than just having a new administration? How much time dividend do you think they still have in front of the others?
This can be looked at in a number of different ways. I mean, the first time they have is the time while they still control Congress, which may well not be more than 2 years. So it's obvious they've got to get a lot done in these next 2 years. Who knows what will happen in the midterm elections? I think it's pretty clear that they have to show that they mean business by changing a lot, and they are. And that really is probably 3 months to 6 months. If 6 months from now things don't look very different, people will say this administration is going to fail. So the first period is 6 months, then 2 years. They have 4 years. The real worry for the allies, of course, is they don't know what will follow Mr. Biden.
That's right.
They were very happy on the whole with Mr. Obama. That was a reasonably good relation. And then it was followed by Mr. Trump. Now, Mr. Biden doesn't control who will replace him. It's quite possible it will be another Republican, and maybe it will be somebody like Trump or worse. And that's the big credibility problem. The credibility problem is not really so much about Biden, it's about America. It's whether Biden represents the sort of future America, the America we're used to, the America we're familiar with, the America we trust, or whether actually he's just an interlude before we get another figure who is impulsive, right-wing, rabble-rousing, nationalistic, and protectionist. And if that happens, then of course trust is gone. So to some degree, Biden can help, but he can't on his own now deliver the trust, the confidence, without a decisive change in American politics. The fact of Trump, the fact that Trump became president is, of course, something people cannot forget.
Martin, there's no institutional changes, at least major institutional changes politically, in the United States yet. So it is really not certain what kind of leader we can have in the U.S. for all the others to observe, isn't it, 4 years from now?
Well, institutional changes in the U.S., deep institutional changes are not going to happen. The constitutional setup is now very rigid. It's very difficult for them to amend the Constitution. They can move institutions of government around, but essentially it's about the people. So the institutions have worked in the past with the right people, and with the wrong people, they don't work. So what we have seen is a change in personnel, radical change in personnel. And the people who are there now are, I have to say, very experienced, very competent, and I think most people in the world in policymaking positions will trust. They will trust their word, and they will trust their competence. And that's the most we can expect at this stage. So I expect this to be a pretty competent and effective administration, but one constrained by American politics and constrained by American institutions, the division of power, of course, and constrained by the fact that Trump happened.
Another issue, China-United States. That's a very important bilateral relations. Nobody would argue about that. The question is, the two sides still have not yet found what they can work on since the new administration come into the office, and confirm that to the rest of the world. Now, both sides have been talking about climate change, which is a common topic for everybody, and it seems both are quite constructive in that regard. So do many coming from other parts of the world, including the UN, have also been complimenting the two sides working on that direction. But Martin, the bigger picture, China-US relations, how do you see that?
Well, the big picture is that they're going through a rearrangement, a reset, as the World Economic Forum describes where we are. There's a reset going on. And Mr. Trump was part of that reset, and it will now continue. I'm quite sure we're not going back to the relationship of 5 years ago. The reasons for that are pretty obvious. There's been a very large shift in relative power. So China is much more equal to the United States now than it used to be. And then there's the whole role of China in the world, questions about technology, trade, all these agenda items are there. They will not go away. I think my hope is twofold. First, that we will find shared projects, things we need to do together. Climate change is one. The recovery from the coronavirus is another very important shared project. Keeping world trade open is another very important shared project. Development and development cooperation is another very important shared project. Things we need to do, in other words, to make the world better. And I also hope that a way will be found to manage and regulate the points of friction that I've mentioned in foreign international relations, in security, in trade, so that both sides know what the other side expects, and a reasonably stable relationship will emerge. It won't be the same as the past, but it's going to be a big challenge. I think Mr. Biden's administration will be much more stable, predictable, comprehensible than Mr. Trump's. In some ways, it might be more difficult for the Chinese government to deal with. But I think there is at least the basis for a new relationship.
For the United States, there were suggestions, at least in some of the policy circles, about selective multilateralism. We have been keeping on having new terminologies, meaning multilateralism, but within only a circle, and it will exclude certain other countries. For example, China might be one of those targets. Is that going to be a smart approach when China's economic, political participation, and also the international development efforts has become such a share, Martin, as you just mentioned? When Washington prefers to go that way, I don't know for now, because they haven't clarified the policies yet. But if they preferred to go that way, will the European capitals go that direction too? Or they need to think twice before they really make a decision?
My own guess is it will be concentric. That is to say, it won't be a clear choice between the two. That is to say, there will be areas, and we discussed some of them,
yes,
where there will be a very big attempt to be fully multilateral. And I think that will be true above all on climate, because it's a global concern. And I think it will be true in some areas of development policy, the sort of things that are done through the World Bank and the IMF and similar institutions. But in other areas, I think it won't be fully multilateral. I think that will apply in a significant way, probably in trade and in finance. And of course, really by definition, the security policies are not multilateral. They are alliance policies.
Martin Wolf, Associate Editor and Chief Economics Commentator from the Financial Times. Thank you so much, sir.